Jonah Kane stood at the edge of his land, a quiet man with sharp eyes and stronger will. His hands, calloused from years of breaking earth and branding cattle, rested on the wooden fence post as he watched the distant hills. His wife, Eliza, was inside, humming a tune while setting the table. Their son, Sam, only 8 years old, chased a stray chicken, his laughter rippling through the quiet evening. Jonah exhaled, his breath slow and steady. This land was more than soil and timber. It was everything. It was his father's dream, his son's future. But he knew peace never lasted long on the frontier. The first sign was the dust cloud rising on the horizon. Riders, 6 of them, moving fast. Jonah's grip tightened on the post. "Eliza," he called without turning. The unease in his voice sent her to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She followed his gaze. "Slade's men?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jonah gave a slow nod. Richard Slade had been circling like a vulture for months, buying up land with money or, when that failed, with blood. Jonah had sent his men packing once before. He doubted they'd come to bargain this time. Sam ran to his mother's side. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "Inside," she told him. The boy obeyed without question. By the time the riders reached the fence, Jonah was already standing in the open, his Colt Peacemaker resting at his hip, his stance solid as an old oak. The leader, a thick-shouldered man with a cruel grin, pulled his horse to a stop. Caleb Morrow, one of Slade's enforcers. His boots hit the dirt as he dismounted, rolling his shoulders as though he had all the time in the world. "Evening, Kane," Morrow drawled, his fingers brushing the ivory handle of his revolver. The men behind him fanned out, forming a semicircle, hands twitching near their weapons. "State your business," Jonah said. Morrow smirked. "Come on now, we don't gotta play dumb. You know Slade's got plans for this land. Ain't no sense in you holding on to it. I reckon that's my decision." Morrow clicked his tongue. "I was hoping you'd see reason. Ain't no need for things to get messy." Jonah took a step forward. "You and I both know you came here to make a mess." The smirk faded. Morrow sighed, then nodded once. The silence before the storm. Jonah moved first. His hand blurred to his revolver, hammer cocking back as he drew. The gunshot cracked through the evening air. One of the riders dropped, clutching his gut. Another gun flashed. Pain seared Jonah's side, knocking him back. But he stayed upright. He fired again, and another man crumpled. Then the world turned to chaos. Eliza screamed from the porch as bullets tore into the wooden beams. She yanked Sam inside, slamming the door just as another shot shattered the window. Jonah ducked behind a water trough, gritting his teeth. Blood seeped through his shirt. The pain didn't matter. Only one thing did. His family. Morrow's men spread out, circling. Jonah picked his targets, firing with deadly precision. But there were too many. A boot crashed into his ribs, sending him sprawling. The sky spun as he hit the dirt. Morrow loomed over him, gun in hand. Jonah tried to lift his own, but a boot pinned his wrist, grinding into the bone. Morrow crouched, grinning. Should have took the offer. Jonah spat blood at his feet. "Go to hell." Morrow sighed. "One day, but not today." The butt of his revolver came down hard against Jonah's skull. The world flickered. The last thing he heard before darkness took him was Eliza's scream. The scent of burning would claw Jonah back to consciousness. His body ached, his skull splitting with pain. He forced his eyes open. Smoke. Fire. The house was ablaze, flames licking the night sky. His heart slammed against his ribs as he tried to move, but his limbs refused. He was on his back, tied. His head swam, the world tilting. A shape emerged from the flames. Morrow, standing at the edge of the burning wreckage. He turned as if sensing Jonah's gaze, lifting his hat in mock farewell before disappearing into the night. Jonah's breaths came ragged. Then he heard it, a soft, crackling cry from within the house. Sam. Raw terror pushed through the fog of pain. Jonah thrashed against the ropes, his wrists burning as he twisted and pulled. His son was in there, his boy. The flames roared louder. With a final, guttural growl, Jonah tore free. The rope snapped. He rolled to his knees, gasping, body screaming in protest. He ran. Smoke burned his lungs as he stumbled to the wreckage. The doorway had collapsed, the frame blackened. He could hear nothing but fire. Jonah forced his way through the ruined entrance, coughing as he shielded his face. His boots crunched over something familiar. His breath caught. Eliza. She lay crumpled near the hearth. Her dress singed, her body still. His hand shook as he reached for her, but he already knew. A sob tore from his throat. He pressed his forehead against hers, whispering her name. Then, faintly, a sound from the loft. A child's cry. Jonah's eyes shot up. Sam. He lunged to the ladder, but it had collapsed. The flames curled toward the ceiling, devouring everything in their path. Sam. Jonah's voice was hoarse, desperate. A shadow moved above him. Through the thick smoke, he saw a small hand reach toward him. Then the beams gave way. The roof caved in, burying everything in fire and ash. Jonah was thrown backward, the force of the collapse knocking him onto the dirt. His ears rang, his vision blurred. The fire consumed the only world he had ever known. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled. Jonah Kane lay still, staring at the ruins of his home, knowing that something inside him had died with it. And what remained was something else, something cold, something unyielding. He was no longer a husband, no longer a father, only a man with a debt to settle, and he would collect it in blood. Darkness swallowed the prairie, stretching endlessly in every direction. The wind whispered over the scorched remains of Jonah Kane's home, carrying the acrid stench of burnt wood and blood. He lay motionless in the dirt, barely clinging to consciousness, his body broken but not yet claimed by death. Cold crept into his bones. His lips were cracked, his breath shallow. The pain in his ribs screamed with each heartbeat, but none of it compared to the hollow, all-consuming void left inside him. His wife was gone. His son was gone. His home was nothing but ash. The wolves had been circling for hours. Yellow eyes flickered at the edge of the fire's dying glow, hungry and patient. They had scented blood and suffering, drawn to the ruin of a man too weak to fight. A low growl cut through the night. The pack leader stepped forward, lean and silent as death. Jonah's fingers twitched. The gun was gone, taken by Slade's men. He had nothing left but his will. The wolf lunged. Instinct drove him. Jonah rolled onto his side, his body screaming in protest. Teeth snapped inches from his face. He lashed out blindly, his fists colliding with thick fur. Another wolf darted in, clamping down on his forearm. He roared in pain, wrenching free. Blood smeared the dirt. He staggered to his feet. The wolves snarled, circling again. They knew he wouldn't last long. Jonah clenched his fists, his vision swimming. His legs trembled beneath him, barely holding. He could feel death's breath on his neck, waiting for the final blow. Then, an arrow whistled through the night. The lead wolf yelped, its body twisting as the shaft buried deep into its ribs. The others scattered, melting into the darkness. Jonah swayed, his vision blurred. He glimpsed movement, a figure emerging from the gloom, tall, silent, wrapped in shadow. Then the world tilted and he fell. A dim fire flickered inside a cave, its glow casting long, wavering shadows. The scent of damp stone mixed with the sharp tang of herbs. Jonah's breath came slow and heavy. His body felt like it had been stitched together with fire. Pain dragged him awake. His eyes cracked open. The cave walls loomed above him, rough-hewn and ancient. Faintly, he could hear the wind howling outside, but inside it was quiet. He wasn't alone. The stranger sat a few feet away, crouched near the fire, grinding something in a stone bowl. His long hair was braided with beads and leather, his bare chest painted with symbols Jonah did not recognize. He moved with the deliberate precision of a man who understood the weight of patience. Jonah's lips parted, but his throat was raw. His voice lost of thirst and exhaustion. He swallowed hard. The stranger glanced at him, dark eyes unreadable. He reached for a water skin, tossing it within Jonah's reach. Jonah hesitated. "Drink," the man said, his voice deep and steady. Jonah grasped the skin with trembling fingers, tipping it to his lips. The water was cool, sharp against his parched throat. He drank greedily, ignoring the pain. After a long silence, the stranger spoke again. "You should be dead." Jonah let out a low, bitter chuckle. The man studied him, his gaze cutting through the dim firelight. "Not yet." Jonah pushed himself upright, his muscles groaning in protest. His side had been wrapped in rough cloth, the wounds cleaned with something that burned. The wolf bite on his arm had been dressed, the deep gash sealed with thick, pungent paste. "Who are you?" Jonah rasped. The man stirred the fire with a stick, embers swirling into the air. "Shadow Wolf." Jonah had heard the name before, whispered in fear and respect. A man without a tribe, a ghost in the wilderness, neither hunter nor hunted. Some said he was a killer. Others said he was the last remnant of a dying world. Jonah exhaled slowly. "Why help me?" Shadow Wolf tilted his head slightly, as if the question amused him. "You fought like a man who had already lost everything." Jonah's hands curled into fists. The flames danced in his eyes, but the fire inside him had long since turned to ice. "I have." Shadow Wolf watched him for a long moment. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he reached for his knife. He pulled it from its sheath and placed it on the ground between them. Jonah eyed it warily. It was a test, a choice. If he took it, he was no longer a dying man in the dirt. He was something else, something with purpose. Jonah reached for the blade. The days passed in silence, marked only by pain and the slow rebuilding of strength. Shadow Wolf did not ask about Jonah's past, nor did he offer sympathy. He simply worked, teaching Jonah how to move again, how to fight, how to survive. At first, Jonah failed. His body was still weak, his reflexes dulled by grief and loss. But pain had a way of sharpening a man, and Jonah had nothing left to lose. He learned how to track by scent and shadow, how to blend into the wilderness like a phantom, how to use a blade not just to kill, but to end a life before it could draw breath. Shadow Wolf never wasted words. He would demonstrate, then watch as Jonah struggled. Only when Jonah began to understand, not just with his body, but with his mind, did Shadow Wolf nod in quiet approval. Each night, they sat by the fire in silence. Jonah spoke little, but when he did, it was not of the past. It was of the future. "Slade," he said one night, his voice steady. Shadow Wolf looked up. "I'm going to kill him." A long pause, then a slow nod. "You will." Jonah exhaled, staring at the fire. The man he had been, the rancher, the husband, the father, was gone. What remained was something colder, honed to a single purpose: revenge. He flexed his fingers, feeling the weight of the knife. Soon it would be a gun. And soon, Slade's men would know the kind of reckoning only the dead could deliver. Shadow Wolf stirred the embers, watching the flames twist and flicker. "You are no longer a man," he said softly. Jonah lifted his gaze. Shadow Wolf met his eyes, unblinking. "You are a storm." Jonah let the words settle in his bones. He rolled his shoulders, feeling strength return to limbs that had once been broken. Tomorrow he would ride. Tomorrow the hunt would begin. And with it, the legend of Jonah Kane. The night was still when Jonah Kane rode into the first town. Shadows stretched long across the dirt streets, lanterns flickering in the windows of saloon and general store. The town was nothing more than a pit stop between law and lawlessness, the kind of place where men disappeared, either into graves or into legend. Jonah reined in his horse at the edge of town, his fingers tightening around the reins. His body had healed, but something inside him had not. Perhaps it never would. He was leaner now, hardened by the weeks spent training under Shadow Wolf. His hands had learned new skills, quicker, deadlier ones, and his heart had turned to iron. Slade's men were here. He could feel it. He dismounted, boots hitting the dirt with a muted thud. His hat was pulled low, shadowing the sharp lines of his face. He had no interest in being recognized too soon. Not yet. He stepped into the saloon, the warmth and noise washing over him like a slow-building storm. A piano played in the corner, off-key, but lively. The air was thick with sweat, whiskey, and bad decisions. Jonah scanned the room. And then he saw him. Jeremiah Finch, one of Slade's enforcers. The man had been there the night Jonah's world burned, his laughter mixing with the crackle of flames. Now he sat at a poker table, grinning around a cigar, oblivious of the fate that had just walked through the door. Jonah moved to the bar, ordering a drink he wouldn't touch. He let himself watch, listening to the drunken bragging, the heavy clink of coins and cards. And there he was. Finch was saying, laughing, "Lie in the dirt like a gutted dog. Should have put another bullet in him. But hell, figured the wolves do the job for us." The men around him chuckled, raising their glasses. Jonah exhaled slowly. He stepped away from the bar, his boots making no sound as he crossed the room. Finch was halfway through another swig of whiskey when Jonah pulled out a chair and sat opposite him. The table went silent. Finch's eyes narrowed, the grin slipping from his face. "Don't recall dealing you in." Jonah tilted his hat back, letting the firelight catch his face. Recognition dawned in Finch's expression, slow and disbelieving. His lips parted, the cigar nearly tumbling from his mouth. "No," Finch whispered. "That ain't possible." Jonah's voice was quiet, deliberate. "Let's play a hand." The men at the table shifted, uneasy. Finch swallowed, glancing toward the others, but Jonah could see it. Fear creeping into his eyes, quick and desperate. Jonah picked up the deck, cutting it clean. He dealt 2 cards to Finch, 2 to himself. "You know why I'm here," Jonah said. Finch's hand trembled as he reached for his cards. I listen, Kane, it wasn't personal. We just... Jonah cut him off with a look. Finch's breathing grew ragged. His fingers twitched toward his belt. Jonah's gun was out before Finch even touched the leather. A single shot rang out. Finch jerked back, chair tipping over as he hit the floor, a red stain blooming across his chest. The saloon exploded into movement, shouts, chairs scraping, glasses shattering. But Jonah didn't move. His gun smoked in his hand. His heart remained steady. Finch gasped for breath, eyes wild. "Please," he wheezed, blood on his lips. Jonah leaned forward, voice low. "Did my son beg?" Finch's eyes flickered, somewhere between pain and understanding. Jonah fired again. The saloon fell deathly silent. He holstered his revolver, stood, and threw a coin on the table. For the mess. No one stopped him as he walked out. The hunt had begun. Word traveled fast across the plains. A ghost had returned from the dead. Slade's men, once drunk on their power, were now looking over their shoulders. One by one, they fell, found hanging in the canyons, shot in the dust, gutted in alleyways. Jonah's vengeance was not loud. It was not reckless. It was patient. He moved to the land like a shadow, never staying one place, never striking the same way twice. Some kills were clean, a shot between the eyes, a blade across the throat. Others were messages, bodies left for the wolves, just as they had left him. Fear spread like wildfire, and Slade took notice. The ranch sat on a hill, sprawling and fortified. Oil lamps glowed in the windows, casting long beams of light onto the dirt road below. Jonah watched from the tree line, his breath slow, measured. 2 men guarded the entrance. A third patrolled the perimeter, rifle in hand. Jonah unsheathed his knife. The first kill was silent. A slit, throat in the dark. The second was a snapped neck, the body crumpling into the shadows. The third man never saw him coming. Jonah wiped the blade clean on his coat, stepping over the fallen. His movements were deliberate, controlled. His heart did not race. His hands did not shake. He moved through the ranch like a ghost. Inside, laughter echoed from the main hall. Slade's men, still oblivious. Jonah followed the sound, his fingers brushing the revolver at his hip. Then a voice, cold and cutting. "Jonah Kane." He stopped. Across the room, standing near the fireplace, was Slade himself. Richard Slade, the man who had ordered his family's death. The man who had built his empire on the bones of better men. Slade smiled, swirling whiskey in his glass. "I was wondering when you'd come." Jonah said nothing. He stepped forward, each movement deliberate. Slade's men shifted, hands resting on their weapons. Slade exhaled, shaking his head. "You've been a damn thorn in my side, Cain." He took a slow sip. "But you should have stayed dead." Jonah's eyes locked onto his. "So should you." Slade smirked. "Let's settle this proper, then." He nodded to his men. They drew. Jonah was faster. His gun was out before theirs left their holsters. 2 shots, one to the chest, one to the head. Bodies at the floor. Then the sound of a hammer cocking. Jonah turned. Slade had his gun raised. They fired at the same time. Pain ripped through Jonah's side, but he didn't falter. He pulled the trigger again. Slade staggered back, blood spilling down his vest. He gasped, dropping to his knees, hand clutched to the wound. Jonah stepped closer, towering over him. Slade's breath came ragged, his hands shaking. "You think this ends with me?" he choked. "There's more like me. Always will be." Jonah stared down at him, eyes cold as a grave. "Not for you." He pulled the trigger. Slade fell. Jonah exhaled slowly, holstering his gun. The fire crackled behind him, shadows flickering along the walls. Outside, the night stretched on, endless and empty. But Jonah Cain was not done. Not yet. The night wind howled through the trees as Jonah Cain rode under a moon half hidden by drifting clouds. His body ached. His side burned where Slade's bullet had torn through flesh, but pain no longer mattered. His work was unfinished. Slade was dead, but his empire still breathed. Crooked lawmen, hired killers, and desperate men who had fed off his power. They would not scatter. They would come for vengeance. Jonah would be waiting. He rode to the outskirts of the valley where Slade's remaining men had gathered, holed up in the last stronghold, a forgotten trading post turned fortress. Lamplight flickered from the windows, voices rising in drunken laughter. Unaware that death was already at their door, he slid from his saddle, pulling his rifle from the scabbard. The weapon was old but reliable, much like the man who wielded it. He checked the chamber, then melted into the shadows. The first man never saw him. A muffled crack, a single shot through the throat, and the sentry crumpled without a sound. Jonah dragged the body into the brush, wiping the blood from his fingers before slipping inside. The second kill was quicker, a knife drawn across the throat, warm breath turning to nothing. Jonah eased the body down, ears tuned to the drunken laughter beyond. Inside, the outlaws drank without care. They thought themselves untouchable, that Slade's death had ended the war. They were wrong. Jonah stepped into the lamplight, revolver in hand. The first shot took a man in the chest, sent him sprawling over the table, whiskey and blood spilling together. The room exploded into movement, chairs scraping, hands scrambling for weapons. Jonah was faster. The second shot hit a man square between the eyes. The third clipped another in the shoulder, spinning him into a rack of bottles. Then someone tackled him from behind. They hit the ground hard. Jonah's revolver knocked loose. A thick arm wrapped around his throat, muscles straining, cutting off air. Jonah twisted, driving his elbow back, feeling ribs crack beneath the impact. His attacker grunted, grip loosening. Jonah seized his knife and buried it deep. The man slumped, blood pooling beneath him. Jonah staggered to his feet, chest heaving. His gun lay inches away, but a voice stopped him. "Don't." He turned. Across the room, standing in the doorway, was Caleb Morrow, the last of Slade's lieutenants. His pistol was steady, his expression grim. Jonah met his gaze without fear. "Didn't think you had the stomach to face me alone," Jonah said. Morrow's jaw twitched. "You killed them all." Jonah wiped blood from his chin. They had it coming. Silence hung between them, thick as the gunpowder in the air. Morrow took a slow step forward. "You could walk away from this." Jonah chuckled, low and bitter. "You know better." Morrow sighed, nodding as if he had expected the answer. He shifted his weight. His finger tensed on the trigger. Jonah moved first. His body was a weapon forged in pain, his instincts honed by grief. He dove sideways as Morrow fired, the bullet grazing his arm. Jonah hit the ground rolling, his fingers closing around his revolver. Morrow fired again. Jonah fired once. A single shot, straight to the heart. Morrow staggered, blinking in surprise as blood darkened his vest. His gun slipped from his fingers, clattering against the floor. He dropped to his knees. Jonah pushed himself up, watching as Moro struggled for breath, eyes flickering with something between regret and understanding. "You were never going to stop," Moro rasped. Jonah stepped closer. "No." Moro swallowed hard. "Then finish it." Jonah stared down at him, gun steady. Then, slowly, he lowered it. Moro exhaled, half a chuckle, half a sigh. "Dying's the easy part." Jonah muttered. "Living with what you've done, that's hell." Moro's shoulders sagged. He nodded, accepting the truth of it. Then, with the last of his strength, he slumped forward lifeless. Jonah stood in the silence. The fortress was quiet now. The men who had stolen his life, who had burned his home, were gone. Slade's empire had turned to dust. The blood had been spilled. The debt was paid. And yet the weight in his chest remained. Outside, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Jonah stepped into it, feeling the warmth on his skin, but it did nothing to chase away the cold inside him. A figure stood by the horses. Shadow Wolf. Jonah approached, slow and steady. The warrior studied him, dark eyes unreadable. "It is done," Shadow Wolf said. Jonah nodded. Shadow Wolf glanced past him, toward the bodies, toward the echoes of violence that still lingered in the air. "And yet you do not feel whole." Jonah exhaled. Was never about feeling whole. Shadow Wolf watched him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then what now?" Jonah looked out across the land, the same land he had once called home. It stretched on forever, vast and empty, a place where men were forgotten or turned into legends. He tightened his grip on the reins, stepping into the saddle. "I ride." Shadow Wolf smirked faintly. "You are a storm, Jonah Kane." Jonah pulled his hat low, his voice quiet, certain. "No, I'm what comes after." Then he turned his horse and rode into the rising sun, leaving only dust and legend in his wake.